everybody. Welcome to the International HRM Webinar series. Delighted you could make it today and to listen to the excellent webinar that we have for you. This series is organised by Simon Fraser University, Mila Lazarova there at the Centre for Global Workforce Strategy, Penn State University, where myself, Elaine Farndale, I'm based, together with Carolyn Adrian. And I'm just doing a quick special shout out to Cara because it's going to be her last webinar, and she has been the person running all the behind the scenes activities for us. So a big thank you to Cara for her help throughout this series. Our other members of the organising group are Marianne Festing and Maral Marapakova at ESCP Business School in Germany and France. And we have Miguel Olivas-Huran from Penn West University. So this webinar series has been running for 6 years now. And we started it during those COVID years as a mechanism for staying connected. And it's just been really popular ever since, with the recordings of previous webinars receiving thousands and thousands of views. So we do have a YouTube channel that you can check out all previous webinars. And this webinar today will be posted within a couple of weeks or so on that site as well. So you have a chance to come back and review things there. So today we have great pleasure in introducing 3 people to present the webinar today. And our speakers are Kate Hutchings, who is Professor of HRM at Griffith Business School, Griffith University in Australia. Miriam Muller, who is an Associate Professor of International Business at the University of Queensland Business School, Australia. And Sue Minto, who is Professor of Organisational Behaviour and Human Resource Management in the Department of Management at the University of Toronto, Canada. I'll introduce the session in a moment, but please, if you have questions or comments, please use the Q&A function. You will not be able to put things in chat. You need to use Q&A. So please remember to put your questions and comments in there. So our speakers today are going to be talking about the many faces working globally, what we already know about minority expatriation and future research priorities. So I won't take any more time. I'm going to hand over to Professor Kate Hutchings.
Thank you, Elaine, and hello and welcome, and thank you very much everyone who's joining our webinar, and for those who may be listening to the webinar at a later date. As I'm joining this webinar from Australia, I will follow our usual custom of acknowledging the people who are the traditional custodians of the land. At Griffith, we pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I'm at Griffith's Brisbane campus, and this is the traditional lands of the Yuggera, Yuggera, Jagera and Turrbals peoples. In my research in recent years, I've increasingly brought together long-standing interests in both expatriates and global mobility and general HRM with a focus on diversity in organisations. I've researched across all areas of diversity: women, LGBTIQA+, age, culture, ethnicity, people with disabilities, socioeconomics. And late last year, I published an edited book on expatriates. At the time of planning that book in early 2023, the world was emerging from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, and there were a range of politico-economic events that were also impacting global mobility. And of course, as we've seen, that's just continued into 2026. At that time, it seemed opportune to provide a current and also some new insights into the state of the academic discipline of academic research on expatriates. And though implications for HRM are presented in that book, the focus on the book was more about examining expatriates from an organisational resource, not from an organisational resource perspective, but rather taking expatriates and their experience as the lens of analysis. In that book, there was a section on expatriate diversity, and I'm very pleased to have the lead authors of 2 of those chapters joining me today to discuss expatriate diversity. Now, while most areas of diversity are well researched in the general literature, in the expatriate literature, most of the focus on diversity has been about expatriates who are women, expatriates of different cultures, to a lesser extent, LGBTIQA+. So as well as discussing these groups today, we will also be examining a newer area of research about neurodivergent expatriates. And we'll also conclude with highlighting some areas warranting future research, in addition for other diverse groups of expatriates. So it's an exciting time of change in expatriate research. Dramatic changes have affected global mobility of expatriates, and markedly so since the COVID-19 pandemic. Such change, though, has significantly altered those people that expatriate, the experiences that they have on assignments. It's been very good over the last decade or so to see that there's been a broadening focus of discussion of expatriates beyond the business organisations to examine expatriates in government, non-government, not-for-profit, and also people in volunteer roles. And we've also seen more research on academic expatriates, sports expatriates, expatriates working in dangerous locations, and of course, health and safety risks, which go well beyond the pandemic. However, we still need to see more research on what I now call the minority expatriates, diverse groups of individuals. In this session today, we'll be discussing expatriates, the people, rather than expatriation, the assignment, and how the assignments affect these minority expatriates as individuals and also members of a family where applicable. Minority expatriates have received much less attention in expatriate research, and it's important to understand their experiences and the support that they require from organisations. Yet, a challenge we've had in this area is around construct clarity. How do we define these people? Who does it involve? Now, some researchers use the term non-traditional expatriates in conversation and in practitioner and academic publications, and they use this to refer to people who have a non-traditional assignment. So what we call a self-initiated expatriate, or maybe people on a short assignment. McNulty defined non-traditional expatriates as people with special circumstances, and this meant that standard global mobility policies typically didn't apply to them or weren't sufficiently encompassing. Non-traditional expatriates were also defined in respect to what they are not. So they're not traditional expatriates. And yet there's not a lot of clarity around what we mean by traditional expatriates either. Traditional expatriates have been defined as assigned expatriates, so posted from an organisation, not self-initiated. They've been defined as expatriates from developed or Western countries. McNulty and I defined traditional expatriates as older men in senior roles that had a woman spouse and probably children that accompanied them on assignments. But given this concern about how do we understand these people that I now call minority expatriates, I thought it was important to have a new term. So if we just talk about people as what they're not the traditional expatriate, there's a problem of othering. So rather than focus on what they're not, let's focus on what they are. So as the term non-traditional expatriates was used in various ways, including by myself, in a 2022 article, I decided that we should instead refer to these diverse groups of expatriates as minority expatriates. So, what does the minority expatriate definition include? Women expatriates, LGBTIQA plus people, or what now is more commonly being referred to as diverse genders, bodies, and sexualities people. It also encompasses a range of family and relationship types: single parent expatriates, expatriates with children that are gifted and or have special needs, expatriates in blended families, multi-generational expatriate families, people on split family assignments. So one person's in one country, another person in the partnerships in another country, both on expatriate assignments, both outside of their home country. It also refers to people of different ages. So there's now more research on older expatriates who are often semi-retired and then relocate internationally, or younger people who are often at the beginning of their career. Let's start with women. Now, we might say, well, are women part of a minority? Well, in terms of numbers, they're not. In many countries, women are 52% of the population. But we talk about them as a minority in the sense that they're underrepresented and they have minority status. It has been suggested that taking an international assignment can prepare employees for more senior roles. It can enhance career progression. So it's a concern that women still remain underrepresented amongst international assignees. Recent industry surveys suggest that women are perhaps 32 to 35% of international assignees. Still not great, but a significant increase from the late 90s when they were fewer than 10% of international assignees. Yet, women remain underrepresented amongst expatriates in a number of areas: male-dominated industries such as the resource sector, lower status expatriates such as women working in domestic service roles as expatriates. Importantly, though, women are better represented in some areas. We believe they're better represented amongst self-initiated expatriates, as entrepreneur expatriates, and in breadwinner expatriate roles. Yet, as we're also seeing post-COVID, organisations are starting to use fewer long-term assignments and more international business travel, but this is challenging for family life. And potentially this may actually lead to more underrepresentation of women in global mobility. Now, this is an area that has been researched most amongst those that I categorise as minority expatriates. The research on women working on international assignments goes back to the late 70s, early 80s. I won't spend a lot of time on this because I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the work of Adler and many post-Adler that have discussed women expatriates. But essentially, the early work looked at barriers to women working internationally and said that women might experience resistance as a manager in overseas locations. This has largely been refuted. It applies in some contexts, but generally, women don't have barriers working across countries. And particularly, they're often thought of as foreigners first and not expected to behave in the same way as local women may. There's also the discussion of women having a lack of interest in international work. Again, a perception largely discredited by many who say women are interested, but they just need support from organisations. So we ask whether women actually experience a glass border which mirrors the glass ceiling that we talk about in domestic contexts. A major obstacle does remain, though, that there's company resistance to selecting women. And for many organisations, there's a lack of support for women's non-work commitments when they relocate. Role models are important. Mentors and networks can be a key to success. But this field has tended to be dominated by strong qualitative research, largely cross-sectional, tends to have smaller sample sizes. This, of course, restricts generalisation. Why do we need more research? Well, there are still gaps. Research has insufficiently considered women expatriates who are from developing economies. Future research needs to consider historical and contextual factors, political environments, structural inequalities. We need to draw more on interdisciplinary research and theory, post-colonial theory, feminist theory, power theories. And Sue Min will talk a bit more about post-colonialism and power when examining culturally diverse expatriates. So we need to understand the experience of women expatriates from emerging and developing economies. We also need to understand the experience of these women compared to women that have become expatriates from developed countries, either going to other developed countries or developing economies. Now I'll hand over to Miriam, who's going to look at LGBTIQA plus expatriates.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Kate. And hello, everyone. I'm Miriam Muller from the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. So the same location, same state as Kate, just different universities. And I'd also like to add that we are the home of the 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games. And I'll just leave that with you for now. I'm not here to talk about the Olympics just yet, but I am here to speak a bit about the LGBTIQA plus expat community. And one of the first things that I think we need to say about that is that the terminology here really does matter. I think it's no surprise that each letter in that acronym has a very distinct meaning. And I'm really grateful to the work of Susan Shortland, who explored in Kate's book, in her chapter, and many before her really, all the different definitions of what it means to identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer or questioning, and asexual. Plus, right? And so sometimes we also see the addition of 2S. That might be a less familiar term, but 2S stands for an Indigenous person with both a feminine and a masculine spirit. So there's a lot to unpack here in that one acronym. Look, as Kate mentioned a minute ago, it goes without saying that some of the communities within our broader expat community are underrepresented, and this community is very much one of them. We're looking at, statistically speaking, we're looking at about 1 in 10 to 1 in 20 people globally being part of the LGBT plus community, according to some research. And given that we have around 200 to 300 million people currently living and working abroad, all else the same, statistically, that community within the expat community is substantial, and we simply need to know more about this community. Okay. So going back to the terminology again for a moment, another interesting fact tied to the issue around terminology is that we've seen some research that has called out the risk of conflation in research. And we've seen that particularly, well, already 20 years ago, I should say, in the work of Hines, where they pointed out that, just as an example, transgender may in fact not be a sexuality at all. So transgender being a person whose gender does not match the sex that they were identified or that they were assigned with, at birth. And it's not the opposite of cisgender. It's not binary. So it's not one or another sexuality. It's simply a different category. So basically what that means is any research going forward on that topic ought to be really precise about which part of the community we are studying and why. So now on the next slide, please. We're now starting to paint the picture a little bit of this community with some facts. For example, homosexuality remains illegal, as an example, in over 60 countries in the world. And that includes a lot of countries across Africa, just as an example, places like Egypt or Ethiopia, Algeria, Gambia, lots of other countries across Africa, including, if we go a little bit more to the other side there, Bangladesh, Pakistan, even Jamaica and PNG. The list is very, very long, unfortunately. And even more unfortunate is the fact that we have a list of where homosexuality is not only illegal, but also punishable by death. It's a short list, but unfortunately there is a list. Mauritania and Nigeria are on that list. They're both are located in West Africa. And then we also have Brunei, Iran, Saudi Arabia and Yemen are on that list as well. On a much more positive note, though, same-sex marriage, just as an example, is recognized now in 30 countries in the world, with some countries being recently added to that list, and that's quite exciting. Thailand, for example, is one of those countries. In mid-2024, Thailand approved the parliament in Thailand rather approved the Marriage Equality Act. It took effect in early 2025, which basically meant that overnight Thailand became the first country in Southeast Asia to legally recognize marriage for all couples regardless of gender. Is that a big deal? I'd say that's a big deal because we do still see a lot of expatriation happening in the Southeast Asia region, to and from, as well as within region. So in Thailand now, we have that legal recognition plus rights. But in some of the neighboring countries, and let's just pick Singapore and Vietnam as an example, while it's decriminalized, there's still no legal recognition. And then in other countries in that region, like Indonesia and Malaysia, where same-sex marriage is criminalized, life in that sense looks a lot more restrictive in these areas. So I think what we can see from these 4 or 5 examples of countries in the same region here is that it's quite a diverse set of experiences that people can get if they operate in that region and are part of that community. All right. So along with these realities, we see a number of barriers, whether it's visa refusals for an accompanying spouse, having limited access to services like healthcare, and also, unfortunately, we're seeing restrictions around adoption rights. All right. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. Now, aside from those macro perspectives on laws and legality, what we see here on this slide is that it's not just a legal risk, but very much a personal, an emotional and a psychological risk calculation that individuals have to take on. And that's not really difficult to believe when we look at reports that suggest that it says 25 to 66% of people in the community have reported workplace discrimination. And of course, that number is higher for the people who've actually disclosed their sexual orientation. So that might not be a surprise, but what might be a surprise is that some of the research has shown us that people in that community may incur lower wages as well as a higher tax burden, which is very unfortunate. So you look at all of those factors together, and all of a sudden an international relocation might not feel like a safe option or an enticing option anymore, especially if an employer isn't prepared or able to provide the support around the assignment experience. But on a positive note, we always have to have a bit of a glass half full and glass half empty conversation here. On a much more positive note, some of the literature has actually suggested that one of the benefits of a same-sex couple can be that they can move independently and apply for work visas independently, right? And that's particularly the case, of course, if they're in a dual career couple scenario or relationship where they each can secure their own work visa rather than relying on that spousal recognition, which might put them work-wise at a disadvantage anyway. All right, and speaking of recognition, next slide, please. What's probably the most under-recognized, or I should probably say underestimated element that an expat in that community has to deal with, it has to be the work that goes into managing their identity. Okay. And what that means is that they must first decide whether to disclose in their country of origin, but also their destination or host country, where to disclose, to whom to disclose, etc. And depending on that combination of being in or out, inside or outside the organization, it really requires them to apply or use a different, sometimes dramatically different level of duplicity, which one can only imagine is exhausting and certainly not conducive to well-being and performance. So with about a minute left on my time here, the last slide here speaks to what MNCs can do. Thanks, Kate. So when it comes to MNCs, the literature actually speaks quite positively and vividly about what can be done to mediate between that individual identity piece and those host or destination country norms that are inevitable. It's also an opportunity actually for the multinational to gain a lot of legitimacy if they do something positively, all right, when we think of that talent attraction piece. And it's things like, really not surprising, but it's things like improving non-discrimination policies, that is, extending healthcare benefits or other related benefits, reimbursable tax penalties, equivalent leave policies, perhaps. And I'm thinking about the case of adoption, so in terms of parental leave. General supportive involvement in LGBT causes and events. I think that's just a given. When it comes to research, there's been some great groundwork that's been laid over the last 20 years, but I think we can do more. Lots of the research has looked at Western expats moving into non-Western and vice versa. I'd really like to see more research that's conducted about non-Western to other non-Western locations, which is why I think the example of Thailand being on that list is so important. Intersectionality, that word is going to come, or intersecting identities, really, that word is going to come up again very, very soon. I think it's time. I think we should already be doing it. So let's find a way to do it. And I'm really hopeful that when we expand those research boundaries and contexts and we explore that intersecting identity space, that's when we're probably going to see a lot more new and different theories beyond the ones that we've already seen, like social identity theory, institutional theory, stereotyping threat theory, the ones that we typically think of immediately. All right, I'll cap it there now, and I'll pass it over to Sue Min. Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam. Hi, everyone. Greetings. I'm grateful to be joining you from Mississauga, one of Canada's most diverse and multicultural cities. Mississauga is an Ojibwe word meaning river of many mouths. In present-day Mississauga is part of the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat Nations. So an uninvited guest, an immigrant, I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to work on this land, where from time immemorial, these peoples and their ancestors have inhabited these lands and is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. Before I start, I also wish to acknowledge that I'm representing the joint work with amazing Marina Schmitz, who I think is on the call, and Sasha Kanko. And this work can be found in Chapter 8 of Kate's book, where we conducted a systematic lit review with a corpus of 240 papers published in a diverse set of management and migration journals. And we sought to understand how cultural and ethnic diversity are treated in expatriate literature. So who comes to mind when we picture an expatriate? Well, the answer we got from the literature for who the expat is that there's a weird default. And weird represents Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic countries. And so historically, this has been the focus, and that's how we've been defining the expat. And so over time, this definition didn't just describe expatriates, it actually became the normative benchmark for research. So non-weird samples or non-weird expat samples had to be explained and justified as worthy of print. And the US as a host country rather than the home country of expatriates was sometimes dismissed as not really expatriate research. So expatriate often signifies privilege and elite status, whereas the term migrant is more likely to be racialized and marginalized, even when people are doing comparable work. And in literature, these groups are often split across research traditions. So the default limits whose mobility is then seen as legitimate, whose struggles are made visible, and which research questions are even asked. So theories of adjustment, success, leadership, and performance are built around weird experiences and then applied universally. This is also the backdrop against which culture and ethnicity and non-weird samples are often studied and too often marginalized and relabeled as migrants. Outside of the weird default, findings are treated as special cases rather than theory shaping, thus marginalizing culturally and ethnically diverse expatriates from theory and practice. Cultural distance with the host country is by far the biggest theme that has received the most research attention in the expat literature. And so we use the term culturally and ethnically diverse expatriates. Kate, if you can move on to the next slide. Thanks. Thank you. To refer to internationally mobile, skilled workers whose racial, ethnic, cultural, national, and linguistic identities differ from dominant weird expatriate norms. Importantly, this cuts across labels. It includes non-white, non-Western, organizational expatriates, self-initiated expatriates from diverse backgrounds, and skilled migrants whose work and mobility closely resemble expatriation, even if they are not granted the same status. So in our research, we found that Europe, countries such as France, Spain, Poland, and the Netherlands and Sweden, and Asia have the largest share of nationalities and host countries in the literature. I'd like to just spend a minute on some of the growing research and interesting work. I'm a big fan of studies by Shay Fan and others, where they highlight the global mobility as occurring within Asia and sort of intra-Asia mobility involving movements between countries such as China, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and South Asian economies. And this body of work shows that intra-Asian expatriation often differs markedly from traditional Western expatriation models, and where assignments may involve regional rather than global career trajectories, different power relations between home and host countries, and culturally specific expectations around hierarchy, loyalty, and employment relationships. Importantly, these expatriates are frequently highly skilled and organizationally assigned, yet their experiences are rarely theorized as normative within expatriate research. Another emerging stream focuses on Asian expatriates working in African contexts, particularly in relation to Chinese, Indian, and other Asian investments and development activities. Research by Jackson and others illustrates how these expatriates operate within complex intersections of race, geopolitics, post-colonial histories, and economic power. And so this literature highlights that Asian expatriates in Africa often occupy ambiguous positionalities. And so while they may represent economically powerful home countries or multinational enterprises, they may also experience racialization, exclusion, or tension in host countries in ways that differ from both Western expatriates and local workers. Crucially, these studies move expatriate research beyond the simple global north-south dichotomy and reveal how south-south expatriation complicates existing assumptions about privilege, hierarchy, and adjustment. And this stream strongly supports calls for post-colonial relational approaches as it demonstrates that power in expatriation is contextual, historically embedded, and unevenly distributed. I think a further important strand of research examines non-Western expatriates working in Western host countries, with work dating back as early as Takeuchi in 2002 and more recent ones as well. And this research shows that expatriation to Western contexts does not necessarily confer automatic privilege or inclusion, and non-Western expatriates may face also racialization, accent bias, legitimacy challenges, and exclusion from informal networks. So this literature is particularly important because it challenges the equation of expatriate with elite Western mobility, right? It reveals how culture and ethnicity operate not merely as differences to be adjusted to, but as structuring conditions that shape whose expertise is valued, whose leadership is recognized, and whose careers progress. And by foregrounding the experiences of non-Western expatriates in Western settings, the stream calls into question the neutrality of expatriate categories and reinforces the need to re-examine how culture and ethnicity are conceptualized and measured in expatriate research. Next slide, please, Kate. And so we find important silences. Expatriates and skilled migrants from Africa, Latin America, Middle East, and South-South migration continues to remain underrepresented. We also see limited attention to intersectional experiences, such as how race, gender, class, language, and legal status combine to shape expatriate lives. And these gaps raise questions about whose mobility is seen as legitimate and whose experiences remain invisible. These silences are, of course, not accidental. They're connected with the weird benchmark. When one form of expatriation becomes normative, other mobilities become unintelligible, even invisible. So what should we do next as expatriate scholars? First, we argue for the decentering of the weird default. So much of expatriate theory still explicitly relies on Western benchmarks of mobility, success, and professionalism. Right, post-colonial and decolonial perspectives that will allow us to take more seriously how colonial histories and racial hierarchies continue to structure global mobility, particularly for expatriates whose presence is differently valued or contested. So future research needs to treat weird expatriate as one of many cases rather than the universal reference point. And this is why we argue that minority expatriates should not be treated as a niche group. This means we need to take culture and ethnicity more seriously as theoretical constructs, right? And in much expatriate research, culture is operationalized as national difference or cultural distance, and ethnicity appears as a demographic control. So we really need to move past that and understand culture and ethnicity as relational, racialized, and historically situated. And we should critically examine how these concepts are defined, measured, and mobilized in our studies. And this agenda then also requires new methodological approaches. Relational, qualitative, and mixed methods are better suited for capturing power, belonging, exclusion, and legitimacy than decontextualized survey designs alone. All right, so there's also space for intersectional, decolonial, and indigenous methodologies that foreground place, reciprocity, community, responsibility, and that challenge taken for granted assumptions about mobility, success, and temporariness. So this opens up new questions. What obligations do expatriates have to host communities? How do mobilities intersect with histories of colonization? And who benefits from expatriation? And who bears this cost? And with that, I'll hand this back over to Miriam. Thanks.
All right. Actually, definitely. Thank you, Kate, for allowing us to write a chapter on neurodivergent expatriates in your handbook. And by us, I mean my collaborators, my co-authors, Dana Ott from the University of Otago in New Zealand, and Emily Russo, an industry fellow at UQ, who's currently located in Melbourne. All right, big topic. Here we go. Neurodiversity is often referred to as an invisible disability. And invisible disabilities make up about 80% of all disabilities. Right? But it doesn't just include neurodiversity. So there are other invisible disabilities, obviously. On the right-hand side, as we can see, I'm sharing some of the more commonly known, cited, discussed neurodivergent conditions like autism or autism spectrum condition, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and so on, which all come with different sets of strengths and challenges. It's very important to say here. And these strengths and challenges are experienced in a disproportionate way by neurodivergent individuals to the strengths and challenges that are experienced by the neurotypical population. We sometimes call it a spiky profile, highs and lows, so peaks and troughs. When it comes to the prevalence, we're looking at, according to the literature at the moment, somewhere between 15 to 20% of the world's population being neurodivergent. Okay, so that's somewhere in the vicinity of 1.4 billion people, and that's the size of China or India, you pick. Neurodivergence exists everywhere. It's not confined to a single country, obviously, with 1.4 billion people, or even to just a few countries. We see it everywhere, from Nigeria to Norway, Samoa to Sweden, and everywhere in between, right? And what it is, this idea of neurodiversity or neurodivergence, what it is the idea that we all have different brains and that our brains are as unique as our fingerprints. And because of the neurological differences that we all have, right, it translates into how we show up, right? It shapes how we think, behave, and interact with others. And so the additional component here is that we should recognize that these are completely natural variations, these differences in our brains, right? Completely natural variations to the human genome. And that it's not something that we need to fix. I'm obviously speaking from a social model or biopsychosocial model perspective. It's not something that we're intending to fix, but rather we want to better understand it and possibly find some accommodation. And of course, that matters regardless of whether we're operating locally or globally. It's just that we don't know a whole lot yet about what it means when we operate globally. So we're going to get there today. No normal brain, there's no default brain, there's no typical brain, but there are a number of caveats that I think are important to name before we take things to that international level now. And those are, number one, not everyone who's neurodivergent will have a formal diagnosis. That could be a problem, or not. Not everyone who's neurodivergent will know that they are neurodivergent. Okay. And there's also a large percentage of those who do know that actively choose not to share it with their employer, which could be their local employer or, their superior at a multinational. 70% of neurodivergent individuals experience more than one neurodivergence, so it gets a lot more complicated, right? And then there's also a languaging challenge. There's different preferences within the community. We talk about person-first language versus identity-first language. So the difference between I am dyslexic or I have dyslexia. There's different preferences, and it's always best to ask the person if they disclose what their preferred way of communicating about neurodivergence actually is. Right? So if that's not already convoluted enough, let's add culture to the mix. And I'm going to ask Kate to turn to the next page or move on to the next page. Thank you. And so what we have here is the definition that we have posed in the book chapter. I'll give you a moment to have a read of that. Half of that definition, as you're making your way through it, is what we know to be true about the expat community. Right? The additional piece, which comes in the italics and the bolded font, is the neurodiversity piece, right? In addition to all the challenges that they're already facing as a quote unquote typical expat, they're now also working through the strengths and the challenges they're experiencing as a neurodivergent individual. Okay, so that means that since nearly 1 in, let's say, 6 of multinational employees would be neurodivergent, it means that there are likely neurodivergent expats in multinationals. And it's also highly likely that they and their families, as you can see in that definition, we're adding that onto it as well. It's a family concern, of course, as well, that they're likely not receiving the support that they should, or potentially, that they should get or that they need during that international assignment. And it's about time that we explore that further. All right, on the next slide now, just to show that this is a real phenomenon, I've pulled a few newspaper articles from recent and not so recent times. One on the left-hand side in the middle is from The Guardian, published in Sydney. It's about a Bangladeshi doctor, or a person from Bangladesh, a doctor, GP, located in Sydney, who's on the verge of being deported because of her autistic son. Okay, now that ended up not happening, but obviously something did happen and it made it into the newspaper. So it was a massive, massive deal. The other example that I thought was really interesting came from New Zealand, New Zealand Herald, which is the one associated with the photo on the right-hand side that you see. It's about a structural engineer whose job it was to make buildings more safe to withstand earthquakes. And that's obviously a fantastic thing for New Zealand. But he was denied residency in New Zealand because of his autistic son. So what we're seeing here is that it does impact, or it can impact expats, but it can equally so impact their families. And what we already know from research is that if the family is impacted, of course, it's going to also impact the expat naturally. And to eventually understand the assignment experiences of the neurodivergent expat, I think a really good place to start is to look at how neurodiversity or neurodivergence is viewed across cultures. And so that's the next slide then, please, Kate. I brought 6 ideas. I'm not going to go through all of them, but let's see how we go here. I'm going to start with the diagnosis and disclosure bit. So we know already that in some countries, autism and ADHD may be labeled and disclosed openly, discussed openly, right? Very much so. But in others, families very much like to keep it a secret from other families or from society, right? And they want to avoid shame or stigma. And that reality will likely influence in a workplace context whether an individual might seek a diagnosis, but maybe it's not even possible to get a diagnosis overseas. And also whether they choose then ultimately to disclose their neurodivergence in the workplace or otherwise. So that sounds somewhat problematic, something to work through. The other example I think is interesting is that of communication norms. So let's skip to the bottom left here, communication norms. We already know that what's considered as normal communication differs across countries or contexts generally anyway. And if we think about how direct we can be, whether we're sometimes more soft-spoken or more blunt, the way we use eye contact in certain cultures, how expressive we are, so that emotional expression that we use or can use or should use, what's appropriate in those regards is something that differs across cultures. But these differences also matter for interpreting some of the neurodivergent behaviors. Okay, one of the most interesting pieces of research I've seen so far is that we're seeing some children of Asian as well as African descent actually being misdiagnosed because when they are getting diagnosed, the person sitting opposite of them think, well, they're just doing the respectful thing. They're not making eye contact because that's what their culture has taught them to do. When really what they're doing is they're struggling with a condition that's associated with potentially autism. So again, culturally speaking, I think there's something that we need to look into further. So essentially what we're saying here is that the same neurodivergent trait can be and will be judged differently depending on the cultural context that we're finding ourselves in. Again, I think from a research perspective, that's absolutely a phenomenal area to explore. All right, I've got about a minute left or so. So on this last slide that I brought with me, thanks, Kate, I'm sharing just a subset of questions that, again, Dana, Emily, and I posed at the end of our chapter. Long list of questions. I'm just throwing a few our way here, such as, at the country level, does the location of the assignment matter? Okay. So would an autistic professional, just as an example, accept an assignment in Canada, but potentially turn down an equivalent role in the Middle East if they knew that that country is more or less welcoming to neurodivergence? And they may have disclosed, they might be diagnosed, they might self-identify, all these variations. We don't know what the connection there is. How do expats, neurodivergent expats and their families adapt? Right, to a new country that has a completely different view about neurodivergence? International schools should be part of that conversations when we're speaking about dependence. Are international schools across the world prepared to accommodate neurodivergent school-age children? And then, of course, in the workplace, when we look at accommodations, the question is, well, what kind of accommodations do organizations or multinationals currently have in place for their employees, full stop? And are those the same, or are they different for neurodivergent expats? Does what they do differ depending on what kind of assignment you're on? Long-term, short-term, flexpatriation, traditional expatriation, and so on. We don't know this yet, but we know that there are likely going to be differences. Just like there are going to be differences about how or in how the employee life cycle is going to be experienced. And Dana, Emily, and I've done some work on that at the local level, but now it's time to take it global. And the responses, we fear or we believe, to all of these questions will ultimately impact how international HRM and global mobility are designed and executed, whether it comes to pre-departure training or the entire on-assignment experience. So lots of food for thought, and I'll cap it here. My time's up, and I'll turn it back over to Kate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miriam. And now finally turning to some gaps in the field and directions for future research. So based on the research the three of us have undertaken and with colleagues and our analysis of prior research, we've identified some gaps in the field in relation to some of the specific diverse groups we've discussed today. But there are also some more general issues that we need to consider across minority expatriates' experience. So firstly, we need to rethink the expatriate default, and Sue Min talked about this a little as well. It's not about adding diversity. It's about rebuilding theory from different starting points. It's about not just having fixed categories, but having lived realities that we consider. Thinking about who counts as an expatriate, what is their individual experience? And we've all touched on intersectionality. There needs to be a lot more work in the intersectionality space. Often the research is very siloed. So it's about women, or it's about someone being in a particular ethnic group. It's about, increasingly, a discussion of neurodivergent people as well. But we need to know about intersecting identities. These multiple forms of identity come together and affect people's experience of living and working in diverse contexts, and will affect them more in some contexts than others, less in some other contexts. But it has the potential to compound the disadvantage that they experience in certain international locations. Also, we've seen significant research for decades on adjustment and performance of expatriates, but future research needs to consider the adjustment and performance for minority expatriates. How is this going to be affected by working in local contexts that, for instance, don't support a DEI agenda? And of course, we're living in times now, we're seeing both organisations being very proactive in the DEI space, but also a lot of backlash against DEI. What does this mean for these minority expatriates' experience? Also, we can think about some other groups that I talked about in the introduction chapter to the book that really haven't been explored at all. One is people with disabilities. So Miriam's done this research on the potential experience of neurodivergent expatriates. But there's a lot of other types of disability out there. Neurodivergence is just one form of disability. We know that in a domestic context, people with disabilities experience a disability pay gap. They're underrepresented in management. They often experience prejudice, ableism, discrimination. So future research needs to look at, does this mean a glass border for these people in not being selected for expatriate roles? What about those that do actually expatriate? What is their experience? What support do they receive from organisations? Also, we can think about Indigenous people. So there's a bit of research on the role that expatriates and also impatriates play in empowering Indigenous people and transferring knowledge about values and practices of Indigenous people. I came across a relatively recent thesis that was examining the experience of New Zealand Maori people in repatriating. But we need to know more about Indigenous people's experience as expatriates. Are they being selected? Are there obstacles to their selection? If they are selected to work internationally, why don't we know about their experiences? How are they drawing on their knowledges? What support do they receive from organisations? And then After the COVID-19 pandemic, the latest big thing that we're all talking about across research is generative AI. Some research is already saying that AI's algorithmic bias could potentially intensify human bias in HRM decisions. So future research needs to consider how AI affects opportunities for minority groups. Does it mean some minorities are not going to be given opportunities to expatriate? Are they just taken out of the selection process altogether? How can we leverage AI to benefit? How can we improve the selection processes so that there is more diversity being seen in the expatriate community internationally? How do we use AI to support global mobility for disadvantaged groups? So they're just a few of our suggestions for directions for future research. We certainly encourage you to consider taking more of a role in researching these important areas, examining expatriate diversity, the experience of these marginalised groups, and perhaps considering some of these future research directions that we've suggested. Thank you very much, everyone. And again, we appreciate you joining the webinar today.
Excellent. Thank you. A virtual round of applause for our presenters today. Very thought-provoking. I have lots of questions and ideas and things in my head. There is definitely a need for additional research, as you've identified. I wonder, Kate, whether you're able to actually give us the details of the book that you have referred to, the chapters and things that people have been presenting.
Yes, just published late last year by Edward Elgar, The Authoritative Guide to Expatriates.
The Authoritative Guide to Expatriates. We'll put details when we post the video on the YouTube channel. We'll make sure that we include those details there for people to be able to follow up.
Thank you.
I have we only have literally a couple of minutes. There's lots of thank yous in the comments for all the presentation today. Can you maybe summarize very briefly, what are your tips for multinationals and international HR leaders on how they might be able to kickstart inclusion initiatives for expats with any of these kind of different types of minority status?
Miriam, would you like to start on that one, given that neurodivergent expats is probably the newest area? Any suggestions for people?
I'd be happy to. I don't usually plug my own work, and since focus is on Kate's book here, but we did have published in AIB Insights a piece on neuro-inclusion in multinationals, and in that we have two sets of tips. One is multinational that hasn't yet thought about neuro-inclusion and what they can do. So we've got 5 tips there, and those who might have gotten started but who want to mature their initiatives. It can be as simple as getting a neurodiversity champion on board. It has to start somewhere. It can be simple. It doesn't have to cost much, but to start the conversation, it often just starts with one person, doesn't it? I'll leave that here. I think that reading is part of the reference list. So if anybody's interested, they can explore that a little bit further. Yeah.
Okay, I'd add some general points as well, thinking about AI as well. AI can actually be used very effectively by organisations, I think, to help identify where there might be biased practices in selecting groups of people for international assignments. It can also be quickly used to gather data on representation. But of course, bias is often going to be built into selection, training, promotion opportunities, previous decisions that favoured majority group employees can actually be replicated by AI. So I think this is a challenge for organisational leaders to think, how do they work around that? And I think another issue too is the question of visibility. So quite often minority expatriates just aren't visible. I think part of the reason we're not seeing a lot of research is we don't know how many minority expatriates are out there. They're not showing up in industry surveys. they're perhaps not appearing in academic research because we haven't been asking these types of questions. There are a lot of forms of identity that remain hidden, that people choose to conceal in a domestic context, and then they're likely to have the same sort of practice when they go to work internationally. So many people may not choose to disclose their sexuality, if they're intersex. There are people that have various invisible disabilities, such as mental health issues, vision, hearing, neurological. These are not evident to other people. There are people of ethnic minorities that might change their name to an English name so that they don't suffer discrimination. So I think it's important for organisations to be working in a domestic setting to try to create more inclusive places where people feel that they can belong and be their authentic selves and be able to actually disclose their identity, their intersecting identities, and then be able to be selected for international roles and supported by organisations. And I think another question we need to think about here as well is organisations avoiding potential discrimination in not selecting people of minorities, but also the duty of care the organisation has to individuals if they are being relocated to countries that they may actually end up experiencing perhaps more discrimination than in their home country context.
Okay, there's plenty for us to think about. Unfortunately, we are out of time now. So thank you very much for all of those ideas, the discussions. That these conversations are going to continue a long time, I'm very sure. Just for the future of the webinar series, we're taking a little break. We'll, as we usually do around this time of year, we will be back in September. There are a couple of announcements going in the chat now about some conferences and calls for papers that are happening over the coming months. We will also post the link to the YouTube channel. There will be, this video will be posted within a couple of weeks, so you can see it there. But for now, I just would like to thank very much all of our speakers today for an excellent presentation, and wish them all the best for their future research, and thank them for giving us such wonderful ideas for continuing our research. So thank you very much to everybody, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.